famine in the history of the world, a tragedy so big that it has been purposefully hidden from us, erased from our collective memory. I'm talking about the Great Chinese Famine that happened in the late 1950s and early 1960s. It is estimated to have killed somewhere between 15 to 55 million people. And this was all caused by one man, Mao Zedong, the leader of China at the time. He wanted to transform China into a modern, powerful communist state. But his obsession with power and his twisted view of the world led him to make some of the worst decisions in human history. And because of these decisions, tens of millions of innocent people lost their lives. Mao's Great Leap Forward was a social and economic campaign that aimed to rapidly transform China from an agrarian economy into a socialist society through the collectivization of agriculture and the rapid industrialization of the country. It was started in 1958 and lasted until 1962. The Great Leap Forward is considered to be one of the worst examples of a man-made famine in history. And the famine that resulted from Mao's policies led to the deaths of tens of millions of Chinese citizens. Mao believed that by forcing peasants to work in communes and factories, they would become more productive and efficient. But this was not the case. In fact, agricultural production plummeted because of the lack of private ownership, the collectivization of farms, and the introduction of new crops that were unfamiliar to the farmers. People were given quotas to meet, but no matter how hard they worked, they could not produce enough food. Farmers were punished if they did not meet their quotas, and they were accused of being enemies of the state. If they tried to leave the communes to find food, they were arrested and sent to labor camps. While all of this was going on, the Chinese government was also trying to rapidly industrialize the country. They set unrealistic targets for the production of steel and other industrial goods. This put a huge strain on the economy and led to the misallocation of resources. Instead of investing in agriculture, the government was spending money on building steel furnaces. The result was that there was not enough food or other basic necessities for the population. In addition to the economic problems, there was also a natural disaster that occurred during this time. There was a severe drought in China, which made it even harder for farmers to grow crops. The government did try to respond to the famine by providing food aid to the areas that were most affected, but the government's response was not enough to prevent the widespread starvation and death. One of the most horrifying aspects of the Great Chinese Famine is that the Chinese government tried to cover up the extent of the disaster. They tried to hide the famine from the rest of the world and even from their own people. They did this by censoring the press and arresting people who tried to talk about the famine. They also tried to rewrite history and downplay the role that Mao played in causing the famine. Despite the government's efforts to cover up the famine, there are still many people who remember what happened. There are survivors of the famine who have shared their stories with the world. And there are also many historians and researchers who have dedicated their lives to uncovering the truth about the Great Chinese Famine. It is important to remember this tragedy and to learn from it. We must remember the millions of people who died, and we must also remember the lessons that can help us avoid similar disasters in the future. One of the lessons that we can learn from the Great Chinese Famine is the importance of human rights. The Chinese government's suppression of freedom of speech and the press led to the deaths of millions of people. We must always stand up for human rights, and we must never allow a government to take away our freedom. Another lesson that we can learn from the Great Chinese Famine is the importance of due process. The Chinese government's failure to follow fair legal procedures led to the arrest and execution of many innocent people. We must always demand due process, and we must never allow a government to take away our right to a fair trial. Finally, we must also remember the victims of the Great Chinese Famine and all of the other victims of communism around the world. We must honor their memory, and we must work to ensure that their deaths were not in vain. If you enjoyed this episode and want to see more, please subscribe, like, and comment.